CSM pumpkins with I-core stems. Complete cast on till done by CSM Love, Karen Ramel. This version uses a CSM ribbed pumpkin body, not shown in this video. Simply make a ribbed tube instead. We are making this today. We will be using a Chambord CSM AccuKnitter using a 72 needle cylinder in a mock rib pattern. So here let's cast on with that mock rib pattern already laid out. This choice to load your needles ahead of time in a mock rib pattern is optional. This is how I did this pattern. However, you could simply use all the needles and cast on and use your project with all the needles in play. What you see here are 11 cylinder needles, an empty slot, and repeated all the way around on this 72 needle cylinder. However, any cylinder, any needle configuration would work. It's purely preference. This cast on method shown is using my universal cast on bonnet. I sell these, and I also have provided free instruction on how to curate them yourself at home. I love these because these are universal. Made on a machine with 96 needles, they can be used on any cylinder with 96 needles or less, and therefore can be used on any machine. When using a split ring bonnet, it's important to follow these exact steps in this order that you see in order for a quick and easy cast on. And in case you weren't aware, when casting on, you only normally need to hang every second ring on the needles there, just so that an average even pressure can be used on the cast on itself. Of course, you could try all the needles, but that's overkill and unnecessary. Now we add the CSM buckles so that we can hang the appropriate weight. I prefer to use the stem weight with 2 to 3, usually 3 pucks total. Some people choose to use their hand to pull down instead of weight. Personally, I choose to use what came with the machine. It does make it easier, and then you have both your hands to use. Ensure to have the right tension set now on scrap. Once you are successful with your cast on, work enough rows of scrap so that your project will not undo when it's off the machine. I like to work about 10 to 15, sometimes 25 rows. After working the scrap, we will start our project at the 3 o'clock mark on our machine. As all projects are started after 3 o'clock position on my machine, at this point noted here, I will work up to that spot, the slot just before, and stop with my scrap yarn. Cut the excess with a little extra so it doesn't undo, unthread it from the machine, and then add my project yarn. I will add a significant length of yarn tail prior to starting my project so that off the machine later I will have enough yarn extra in my project in order to start finishing it after I've taken it off the machine. Project yarn tail is usually about an arm's length. Don't worry about any further length than that because you can of course always add more project yarn later as needed. When placing the excess yarn tail in the middle, be sure that none of it's caught up on the needles like I did initially here. Make sure all your latches are open before you start and you will have success. Once we're ready to start, ensure your row counter is at 0 and work 70 rows. At my machine setting and this acrylic yarn that I'm using, this was the gauge that was produced. Your settings, your yarn might produce a different type of knitting. Not to worry, this is all preference. You'll notice that with the mock rib pattern of 11 needles between each segment of empty slots, this is creating an easy defined tube that will later be even easier to finish with yarn. If you chose not to use the mock rib slots, that's perfectly fine. So we're approaching the 70th row of this project and we will stop at the 3 o'clock position. Just before actually. And now with another length of an arm length of yarn, we will cut above it and let it sit inside the tube and switch to our scrap yarn, which will help hold the live stitches. And once again, with the scrap yarn, when we are working with it, I choose to work anywhere from 10 to 25 rows. You have the choice of working that scrap, taking it off the machine like I demo in this project, or to continue working another project continuously in segments so that you don't necessarily have to stop after each project if that's your wish. With this project today, we are going to stop just before 3, cut the scrap, and take the project and its scrap yarn off the machine entirely. I take the weights off so they won't hit the floor. I pull down on my project, and I always go very slowly not to break any latches while the proximity of the yarn carrier is very close to any cylinder needles with no yarn on them, so nothing gets bent or broken. Once we remove the scrap from the machine with our project, we will go to our workspace and look at the components of this project today. Here is my universal cast on with the split rings and where the scrap is, the orange project, and further scrap. So our first step is to turn our project inside out. We want to take the project yarn closest to where our cast on bonnet is. So find our yarn tail, the orange yarn tail, on the edge closest to the cast on bonnet, and we want to take this and put it through a darning needle. What we hope to do at this point is catch all of our live stitches. Sorry for the blur here. Just fold over this project yarn and thread your darning needle. It's easier. If you're finding it splitting, just twist your project yarn. Now you can see I'm following along in the direction that this row was worked. It was worked from the top down. So using your darning needle, find your first loop of your orange project yarn and run through it with the needle. Now continue with this first project row of loops. We're catching the live stitches. What we want to do is we want to do this all the way around the project. This is a very similar technique if you were making a hat. You'd need to gather all of those live stitches, and then the next step after this would be to take the scrap away on this side. Once the scrap is taken away on this side, none of our orange project live stitches are going to unravel because we've trapped them with this darning needle and yarn. This was why on both ends of our project we added sufficient arm lengths extra of project yarn. So I'm just going to speed the video up here as you get the gist. We are doing the same thing all the way around the project. Now we chose to work in the direction that this row is being worked so that it functions better when we pull on the yarn as a drawstring. If we worked in the opposite direction, it would not gather as nicely or as smoothly. As we approach the last few stitches of the row, try not to go through the same orange stitches more than once. Once we've gone through all of them, we will stop and cut initial row of the scrap yarn so that we can start to remove the scrap yarn from our project. You could have optionally worked the row between the orange yarn and the scrap yarn with a row of ravel cord to make this next step easier, but I did not. I chose to just use scrap yarn. I prefer the method when I'm using yarn that's scrap like this to cut at a few areas. Be very careful not to cut your project yarn, only the scrap yarn, so that you can pull out your scrap in segments. Sometimes scrap yarn will pull out very easily. Sometimes it will snag and catch. You will note my scrap yarn here is a combination of a bunch of strands that I had worked together and chose to use as scrap instead of another purpose altogether. So it sometimes pulls out, sometimes gets snagged. which was why I choose to do it in short segments when I'm taking it off like this. A ravel cord is something that's slippery and sometimes is very easy to pull out, but it is a preference. Sometimes we choose not to use a ravel cord just because sometimes the tension's different, but it wouldn't have mattered in this scenario. So I will work through removing the scrap on this edge from my caught orange stitches and try delicately not to have anything pull my orange project yarn. So at this point, I'm just separating the scrap from the project. So at maybe this point of the video, this would be a good reason to have ravel cord. I would have already separated my project at this point, and I still haven't fully done it yet. But in segments, I manage it step by step. So it's your call. All right, I tried to make that less painful. I sped it up while we finished it, and there we are. We've separated the scrap and cast-on bonnet to our orange project here. So I'm showing you the edge. All those live stitches are trapped with the yarn tail that we used. It looks great. So this, we are currently on the outside. So at this point, we will do the same to the other side of the project. So we've just shown you how to use the first side. So the method is exactly the same. So once again, I'm going to speed up the project to the next step. So at this point, this second side, treat just as you did the first, capture all those live stitches. Take the project yarn off and we'll go to the next step. Okay, so now all scrap has been removed from your project. The project itself looks like a tube. We're still on the purl side of the project, the inside. Now we need to close one end. So gently pull on your drawstring end. Pick an end, doesn't matter. Do only one at this point. Pull gently on it to bring and gather all the end stitches together, like the beginning or the top of a hat. Everything evenly dispersed. Just hold it with the stitches and gently just pull on the yarn so that it all tightens up. Once you have a completely gathered end, then you will need to thread the yarn tail in a darning needle, and folding over the yarn makes it easier to thread your darning needle. And then you're going to use that darning needle with the yarn tail, and you are going to reinforce this circular opening of this end of the project. And the reason why we are going to reinforce it is this is an end that we will use both to segment the pumpkin and to bring the height of the pumpkin together by using the yarn later. So it's not a bad idea to reinforce this circular area. This gives you more security for later. How you do it doesn't matter. This end generally won't be seen from the good side. So just gather, go up, go down, go up, to go down, grab little bits of stitches here and there. Try to do so evenly all the way around. But like I said, it doesn't truly show. So as long as you somewhat evenly gather these edges like you see, great. And a good trick I have whenever I'm tightly pulling on the yarn and wanting to maintain the tightness of the pull is go through a stitch, kind of like, let's see if I've got any here. I'll keep going around. Okay. Yeah. And then when it's time to kind of secure it, which you can just do indiscriminately whenever you want on this side at this point, is what I like to do is I'll put the yarn through, or rather the needle through a little bit of the project, and then loop a bit of the yarn tail around it like a knot, and then pull on it so there's a bit more tension. I'm doing it here. So I wrapped it around the yarn tail. See, it's the loop. And this is just enough tension to kind of make a knot without making a knot. So you'll gently tighten up all the strands and then pull on it. And this will help keep the tension of all the yarn that you've already kind of secured within the circular end of this part of the project. If you did it 1 or 2 times, perfectly fine. But you'll find later when you're doing the segments of the pumpkin, and each pass has quite a bit of tension on it, so it's not a bad idea to kind of reinforce or secure it. So now we are going to the good side of the project, turning it right side out. The reason why we close the end on the inside is just to maintain, just in case you were a little more sloppy or just less capable to stay towards the very center, you'd want it to not have a spout end, you'd want it to be on the inside. So by doing it simply that way, that just makes it look better. So at this point, I am cutting up scraps of fiber, which will be used as stuffing for the inside of this project. I'm simply reusing what I have, what I no longer want to use, etc. Use whatever you want, but do try to have it all the same color or similar color, so any changes in the stuffing color that come through the project don't look funny. All right, so stuff this down into your project nice and firmly. Pretty much use whatever stuffing you want. You could add catnip, make this a cat toy. You could do whatever you want. It's full preference. Now, how dense of a pumpkin you make is purely your choice and preference. I like to add somewhat very dense stuffing, and don't worry about shaping at this point. Just try to get all of what you want to use in there. All right, so now your project is full and it looks kind of funny. It looks like a potato with an open end or a sack of something. So pull on the drawstring once again, like what we did before on the first one. Determine if it's full enough and actually go ahead and thread that top yarn that we just used to close that top and final hole with a darning needle, and secure it tightly closed as we did before, and reinforce the edge. Once you've done that, we're ready for the next step. I am not going to go over that since we have already. Now the end is closed. Now we need to secure on every pass the beginning of the yarn with a nice firm connection. I just ran it through twice as you saw. And now go along your mock rib guidelines. Now, if you had made this without the mock rib, that's fine. Just figure out where your guidelines need to be and then lay them out as you have to the opposite end, and also secure them at the circular middle part. So you're basically creating tiny orange wedges with the yarn. And now what you're going to do, segment your orange by pulling tightly on this fiber. When you pull tightly on it, make sure every time that you do so, you tie a knot or you secure it with a double wrap or some sort. At this point, we're just segmenting the pumpkin in the shape we want. At the very end, we will change the height of this pumpkin from top to bottom, but that's a little bit later. So it's going to look a whole lot of wrong before it looks right. So just continue with every pass, securing it at the top, running down your mock rib, and then going to the opposite end and doing the same. Try not to run your segmenting fiber in ways you can see it between the segments. Try to run your darning needle from the middle section to the next section at the very middle of it. Just like you see, we don't have yarn going crosswise. Everything that you see now is just basically finishing touches. We're making segments that are divided by strong piece of yarn that is connected on each end. That's pretty much it. Okay, and now that the last segment has been divided, it's almost perfect. Now I want to secure the yarn in the middle of the joins here and just kind of bring it all in, make it more tidy and neat and less wrinkly looking. And to do that, we'll continue to reinforce the middle sections as we've done before. And this next step is to secure once again the yarn with your darning needle, nice and firm, and to run the needle with the fiber from the top to the bottom. This final pass is designed to change or adjust the height of your pumpkin. Redirect your needle with the yarn on it until you can see it. Pull it through and make sure it doesn't catch on anything. All your fiber should now be on one side of the pumpkin. And now, as you can see, we're pulling in. We're making the height of the pumpkin a little more compact, similar to what these normally look like in real life. And with some tension, we are going to tie a knot with these yarn tails, improvising and taking care of the residual orange project yarn tails. Secure double knot, doesn't hurt. And then what we'll do is we'll cut the excess and we'll feed the tails into the inside of the project. Personally, I prefer to do so with a darning needle, but in this next example here, I use a latch hook just because it is through the center of a donut. I don't recommend a latch hook, but if it's all you have, this here will work. As you can see, all I did was open the latch of my long latch hook and pulled it through and pulled the yarn tails to the opposite side of the project and cut. Okay, so we're back to the machine again, and this time I've set up 6 needles only to make the I-cord. You can do any number of needles. Certainly a cylinder that has slots further away from each other, like a 54 or 72, would be better for doing I-cord. And note that I hang the very first, the ones in the middle, and certainly the last needle always, so that everything is even. I add my CSM buckle like we did before. This is my universal cast-on bonnet again. And we'll add this time the stem weight with less weight on it, as the same number of pucks or weight as I did initially was too much pressure on just 6 needles. You can't tell from this view, but it's a lighter stem weight assembled there. All right, so we will add the heel spring to the top of our topper system so that it maintains the tension, and we will thread everything up and engage the heel spring and bring our green project yarn, no need for scrap at this point, all the way into our machine and into our yarn carrier. The yarn tail can be maybe 6 inches long. We'll bring the yarn carrier around and make sure that the latches are open, the yarn feeds easily, and the first stitches of the initial row happen without problem. All right, you can let go of your yarn tail start, and because you have your heel spring engaged, the slack is taken care of on the machine and the next rows can happen. Be sure to reset your row counter if you haven't already and work a number of rows. At my setting, tension and yarn, I worked 21 rows total. Here I'm checking to see what it looks like with the weight lifted up. For this project, I only worked one strand, but for the larger pumpkin project, I actually fed 2 strands of yarn and did about 8 needles on the stem. So you have a choice on what kind of density the stem should be. And although the I-cord itself is a bit floppy, it's during the finishing that you can reinforce it with the extra yarn tail on a darning needle. Looks like we are at our end. So at this point, we're going to cut the project yarn above. Once you've had the desired length of cord produced, you can now decide to end your project. I left a yarn tail and cut it and left the weight on and then put a darning needle on the yarn tail. I later found it was easier to take the weight off the project to do this next step, but you could do it with the weight on or not. You're basically moving the needle and catching each live stitch, kind of like you did on the project with the scrap yarn. There's no need to add scrap. We can do it right here very easily. Take the stitch off the needle. Everything is really loose, so it is actually easier if you do it with the weight off so that things don't get stretched out, because then you have to tighten it. So taking each live stitch after catching it off the needle, you only do the ones that you see there, which is the 6, and then lifting it off the cylinder itself. All right, with everything completely off the machine, let's go to our workspace. This is what it looks like off the machine with the universal cast-on bonnet still attached on the left and our finished cast-off on the right. So first we'll go to where the yarn is still connected to the split rings on our cast-on bonnet. Now all I did simply here, there's no weight on it, so all I did was undo the live row using the yarn tail. I just pulled it out from every split ring. That of course left live stitches if I wasn't careful, but I didn't find this part very difficult. Working on removing the project from the cast-on bonnet was very easy. Now you have a stem that has a finished end, kind of, and a live stitch end. All we did was thread a darning needle and capture all the live stitches as we've done before, very straightforward, and then decide which end of this would be the top of the stem and which end of this would be the stem kind of buried within the inside kind of middle area of the pumpkin. When I finished this edge, I looked at it and thought how nice and clean and square-ish this edge was. So this edge that we're closing now of the live stitches ended up being the outside of the stem, the very top of the stem. So once you've secured all of those live stitches, simply use your darning needle with the extra fiber and reinforce the I-cord. Now do this in any way you can using your normal techniques for hiding a yarn tail. Simply bury the needle within the work indiscriminately around it, and this will help reinforce it to give it a bit more strength and less floppiness. If you are someone who prefers to have a stem that you can bend to shape, you might have wanted to put, at this point from the bottom, put a pipe cleaner in there or something, but I didn't find the need for it. So simply use up all this extra scrap and just kind of just indiscriminately find somewhere to put the needle, tighten up any looser area of knitting, and just run the needle through and just kind of hide it. It's actually very easy being that it's the same color. Make short little steps with the stitches. You don't have to follow any rhyme or reason. Here I traveled quickly down the highway of the middle to the halfway point just to kind of help the yarn get to closer end of the base. So the base of this stem needs a bit more strength. It needs a bit more kind of sturdiness in order to stand up. So I'm just simply working the yarn tail down to the base, which had the cast off. Because I had the weight on it when I did the cast off, the left side, the cast off is longer and stretched out, but which is fine because I will hide that in the join of it sitting on the pumpkin. Let's bring on over our stem and work the yarn tail with a needle, a darning needle. Work using the green yarn from the stem project. We will attach it to the pumpkin near the center at the base. The basic rule I followed here was once I went through the orange, then I went to the green, then I went to the orange, then I went to the green in a somewhat even basis and worked my way around circular motion to try to make it look more natural, securing the green stem in such a way that there were no spaces, no loose spots. Everything just seemed pretty flush. After doing a couple passes of that, I did it again just to make sure all the areas were balanced and attached in a firm way. By running the yarn tail with the darning needle here through the stem multiple times and through the join, you are reinforcing it and making a firm structure for which the stem will better sit